The very first book I wrote, called The Bluest Eye, was when I was not really thinking about publishing or reviewers or other readers. It was a book I wanted to read, and I couldn't find it anywhere. So I began to write it, and it took forever because it had no real reason for being done except my own reading pleasure. It was like a long reading exercise that took 5 years. So when I would read it and I didn't like it a bit, I would change it. I think it's been very helpful for me to look at it as a reader because it gives you distance. Your ego is not all entangled in it, and you're not just thrilled with it because you wrote it. And some writers really prefer to be authors. Those are people who write because that's what they do, or someone has asked them, or they have a contract. I really call myself now a writer because I only write when I can't not do it, when I'm so compelled to do it. And part of it is what I presume will be, since I'm a very good reader and a very fastidious and careful reader, very picky about what I like, I would try to write the kind of book that I really wanted to read.
It's brilliant because, in fact, I mean, it's reading is the whole way in to a writer anyway, isn't it?
Of course.
It's got to be. But why did you then, you had a good job as a publisher's editor.
That's right.
Lecturer? Was a lecturer before or after that?
A little bit during that time, yes.
Same. So lecturer, editor, so you're already immersed in books,
Yes.
other people's books. But you were fairly late starting to write yourself. Now, what made you write, start you off writing?
I think the situation was one in which my back was really up against the wall. I was recently divorced. I had small children. I had a new job. I lived in a small city then. That part of the company was in a place that was strange to me. And I knew that the company was going to move to New York City. So I didn't make any friends because I thought I would leave them soon. In short, I was miserable, absolutely. And even though I had a lot of responsibilities, it's amazing how much time there is when you're unhappy. Some people fill up their misery with parties and dinners and so on. But if you don't do that, the children go to sleep at 7, and then there's the long night before you have to get up the next morning. And that's when I wanted to read this book, because that's what I'd always done in downtime or uptime. I am a reader. And at that time, I was 30, and I really wanted a certain kind of experience I wanted to share. Didn't analyze it terribly much, but I knew that I wanted to read about people like me, people who were black and were young and had lived in the Midwest, and nobody wrote about them. And whenever they did, they were never center stage in a text. They were always toys, background, scenery. And also, the most important thing for me when I was writing is that in this emotional chaos that I was in, the whole world takes on that view. It all looks disorderly. You cannot trust your judgment anymore. The single clear thing was the children. So you're living in a world of chaos. Writing ordered it for me.
Also, I mean, it must have been, when you say you were very unhappy at that time, right, and you had your children, but I used to find that if my husband was away and my children and I were there, it was also very lonely. You didn't go out, and you sort of felt suddenly when they went to bed, that silence in the house, and you were very lonely. And I think writing must be brilliant if you're lonely, because you're suddenly sharing your thoughts and you're putting them down.
That's right. The solitude is critical. People have said that unhappy childhoods make good writers because they tend to read because they're miserable or escape. And the solitude and the loneliness or the aloneness in which you really have only your own company. And if that isn't sufficient, then you will invent other company, and that's what fiction is.
Was your first book, as is proverbially said, all writers write their first book and it's autobiographical? Was yours?
There was a strong taste of my own life in that book. The geography is the geography of the town I grew up in. The relationships are not the same, but I certainly pulled from real people for information, because you're scared, you know, when you write your first book, and you don't trust your imagination, so you go straight to what you know. And then the more I got into it, the more I loved the part that was invention, that was not factual, but true, somehow truer because it wasn't factual.
It's funny though, when you were saying yesterday that it's a danger to write about yourself, though, if you're writing about another character. You gave an
yes.
illustration of that, didn't you?
Or was I probably talking about sliding in the way an actor or an
That's
actress
right.
does into a fully visualized or fully realized character? At which point, if you begin to use your own emotions and your own self in order to inhabit the character, you're doing them a terrible injustice. Your emotions may not be large enough, or they may be too small, or they're not accurate. They're not authentic necessarily for the character. The character needs your intelligence, not your confused emotions, or even your strong ones. You have to operate from some other place.
But when your publisher looked at it, he actually said this painful bit about
Yes.
a woman who'd been her husband had been disloyal to.
Yeah.
But when you wrote about it,
I wrote about it in what I thought was the most beautiful language to convey the feelings of having been betrayed. I said to him, this is pure, beautiful, distilled pain. And he said, it's demented. And I quarreled with him about that. And finally I said, it is perfect. This is the way it is. He said, yes, Toni, but it's your pain, not hers. And he was absolutely right, which is, you can tell an editor has one sentence that suddenly you know exactly what the error is. And I had written it the way I would have responded to that situation, in my language, my perceptions, and not the characters. And it was awful. So I rewrote the whole thing from her point of view.
an actor's got to do it too. They've got to
Exactly.
simulate the feeling, but they of the person, and not put their own feelings
Exactly.
into it. That's
Exactly.
right. Yeah. Now, when you came to write Beloved, which I do think is a great book. You did it. You weren't going to write about slavery. You said, but you ended up. Why not, though? By the way, did you not want to write about slavery?
Oh, it's too awful. I just didn't think I had the resources, emotional or intellectual or artistic, to dwell in that period for the time it would take to write that book. I just didn't think it was possible for me. And when I ended up in the era, I had been dragged there by the force of the ideas and the characters that I had invented. And I really felt as though I were being kicked into that place, kicking and screaming and saying, why couldn't this life, this problem, this world I want to talk about be in the 1930s or something that I thought I could deal with? I just didn't want to go there. It was too painful. And then I thought, well, if they lived it, then maybe I could spend a few years simply writing it. It was certainly not a life-threatening circumstance. So, but it was not my choice to do that. I was convinced that I was describing some very contemporary problems.
Well, slavery could be substituted for dire poverty. It could be substituted for somebody feeling crippled by life. I mean, like the irons in their mouth is the
dear.
way in which some people can't speak about what they feel. I feel that the slavery in your book could be substituted by us, the readers, for whatever we almost want it to be too.
I suppose, in fact, it does function that way. You don't really have to have those experiences. You only have to translate them into one's own individual and, I suppose, human terms, because it's still with us, the residue, not only the historical residue, but the conscription, the problems that such women faced then are still here. We still have to determine how to be complete human beings, how to be responsible to something larger than ourselves, how to be parents, how to be workers, how to be philanthropists, how to take care of and nurture the other, and at the same time, how to be this very unique person.
You began it because of a story you read about a woman called Margaret Garner, who had killed her children because she couldn't bear them to
Live the way she had.
live the way she'd lived.
She had escaped from slavery. She had made it into a free state with 4 children. And at that time, a slave owner could enter into free territory and take them back. Sort of like the sanctuary movement that's going on in the States now. And the law was controversial. But at any rate, a month or so after she had gotten into free territory, the man did come for her. She saw him and instantly ran out into the back to kill those children. She wounded 2, cut the throat of a 3rd, and was about to bash the head of a 4th into the wall when they caught her and imprisoned her. So that story was haunting, you know, because it was not an exhausted mother. It was not contempt for the children. It was what she said, because she was interviewed a lot. She's in her 20s, and she's very serene. And she said only, they will not live the way I have. And death, she felt, was better.
You often read in papers of say, a case like a father who shot his family and then shoots himself. And people say, but he loved them. He was such a loving father. Why could he do it? Could you get behind that thinking? Well, you did. You got behind it in Beloved. But how difficult was it for you to perceive of being able to say, kill your own children, because you couldn't face life for them?
It's a very, very extraordinary reaction, because what you just described, the fathers always take everybody with them. The mothers commit suicide and leave the children.
Yes.
They don't take their children with them. There's something very interesting about the ways in which males and females respond to that kind of despair. But a woman who takes her children's life, most of the literary precedents for it were Medea, who was really concerned with a man, and she was trying to hurt him by killing her own children, whom she loved. There were tales, I have read them, about them, of women during the war who were in concentration camps, who had to make quick choices, and any choice is the wrong one. And it was that moment. Anything that Margaret Garner would have chosen to do at that moment would have been a disaster. It was a perfect dilemma. I didn't know how to judge her.
Yeah.
So the only one I felt who could judge her would be the daughter she killed. So she, in fact, does return in order to claim what she has been robbed of, which is a mother's love and life, and also to accuse her. She's the only one who can say, how do you know death is better for me, since you've never died? Maybe it isn't. No one else is in a position to ask that question.
No, which is why you brought back Beloved, the daughter, as well. It's a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a ghost?
Well, it's a character that everybody in the book believes is a ghost, but it's a fleshed ghost.
It's brilliantly done, though. It actually nearly made me believe in ghosts, which I don't.
Well, she could also be a person, you see.
Yes.
The evidence is there that she is a traumatized survivor of a slave ship. The language she speaks is the language of someone who indeed may very well have remembered what that was like. And it's the language of death. The questions they ask her when they say, what was it like over there? Could be the other life. It could be a whole of a slave ship. And it was dazzling to me to know that the vocabulary was the same.
When you get the ghost confronts, or the person confronts her, the heroine who had killed the child, in the end, the heroine has to herself forgive herself.
Oh, absolutely. Regardless of the noble motives and the maternal feelings she had and the inescapable reasons for doing it, the whole house is inhabited by their desire for explaining, justifying, and when the ghost spirit moves and she sort of returns in the flesh, the consequences of that encounter are never what Setha, the heroine, the mother, would have expected. All she wanted to do was to love her more. Explain. Let me tell you why I did it. You'll understand, won't you? And of course, the child doesn't
No.
understand at all. All she says is, "You left me."
Do you think it is possible then for someone to forgive themselves even when they've done something absolutely terrible? Yeah.
Yes, it's called grace. At some point, you do. If you don't, you're in a cul-de-sac. But you have to go through the fire first. You have to experience the full fall and the complete self-loathing in order to come around to something like the forgiving of oneself. It's when you skip responsibility, when you use a substitute emotion like guilt, which is of no use to anyone.
No.
But if you feel the real thing, which is shame, hatred, humiliation, and self-loathing, that is the door. And if you get through that, then you can forgive yourself.
Do you think you ever did that when you were a young girl? Because I think I did. And I didn't know what I was guilty about, and I didn't know what I was loathing about myself. Probably that I was growing up and I didn't like myself in some ways. And any little misdeed I did, I felt was kind of horrifically big.
I think I was unfortunate because that only came to me much later. It would have been healthier for me had I gone through that at an early stage. But for me, it was much later because I was given to believe when I was young that I was smart and bright and cheeky, and practically everything I did turned into something wonderful. So I sort of postponed the confrontation that I had around the time that I'm talking to you about, when there was only me and my own company.
That's when you did it?
That's when I did.
Yeah. Do you think everybody at some point needs that confrontation with
Absolutely.
themselves?
Absolutely. All of the characters in my books, whether they are successful or not, they're all pushed into that place where all the definitions of themselves are suspicious. You say, "You are my friend, Insula. Let me see what friendship is. Are you a good person? Are you a good mother?" And the circumstances have to be invented so that the characters, which I believe is also true in life, you have to simply be stripped down and made very lean, and so that you can see who you are. And then you make peace. It's difficult, but it's absolutely important. Otherwise, you never arrive at this delicious place called adulthood.
That's right. That's right. I think your book has got the merit of drawing people into it, and then you frighten me, and then you kind of put your arms around me. I had that feeling in your book. Is that a feeling that you wanted
the narrator's presence or voice to take the hand of the reader and say, this is going to be terrible, but don't worry, it's already happened. I have been there, and we can get through it together, and it's going to be fine.
You use a lot of memory from ancestors somehow in the book. Do you not? I mean, do you believe in that? Do you believe that ancestors that you have not known can be still coming through us, working through us, and we retain some memory
I do now.
of them? You do now?
I do now. My whole education, was to make sure I didn't believe things like that, and I dismissed all sorts of things that were indigenous in my family, superstition and, the discredited information, the discredited way of knowing that discredited people always have. But when I began to write, that was the place where I had to go. That's where the information was. That's where the images were. That's where the language, the color came in these tales, folk tales, attitudes, the normal, easy acceptance of signs. And then things began to happen that were really quite startling.
The stump of a tree,
Yes.
which you use where a woman appears, a dead woman appears, is exactly the stump of a tree in fairy stories where a little creature will appear when the children are going through the woods and they become friends or enemies of it. Is that part of a folk memory thing in your case?
Had I thought of the fact that it is very much a part of the fairy tales, I probably wouldn't have put it in the book, but it was a very personal experience that my mother had. She and her sister, as a child, had been playing in the woods, and they saw a woman on a stump, their aunt, and they ran toward her with such enthusiasm, calling her name, and she looked away from them, and she began to moan, and they suddenly got terribly frightened, and they wouldn't go any closer because she was behaving strangely. So they ran home to tell their mother they had seen their aunt, and she was behaving strangely, only to learn when they arrived that that woman was dead and had just died. She's told me that story and millions of others, and my father and my grandparents, all of which they were not alarmed about at all. They had this very sort of comrade relationship with spirits. Well, my studies at college and high school and graduate school, was a different world.
Yeah, driven that out of you.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I found it to be, the world as enchanted began to be the source of so much. And it also began to be artistically, strategically important. The ghost in Beloved is not only because the people believed in ghosts. It's not only because Sethe needs the ghost. It's also structurally a way to say memory can come in and sit down next to you at the table. And even though you don't want to remember, and you're trying very hard not to remember, it's always there. It's always with you. And sometimes a situation arises in which you cannot put it off any longer. So it had both structural solutions were solved for me, as well as my ability to use that aspect of the culture which believes that ancestors are the benevolent, guiding spirits that we are and can be constantly in touch with.
Well, I hope you're going to let me be constantly in touch with you by writing another book
Of course.
quite soon. Thanks very, very much indeed for talking to me today, Toni Morrison.
Thank you.